Trapped in the glass. Prologue. The night was heavy, suffocating. The kind of night where even the wind hesitated to move, as if afraid of disturbing whatever lurked in the darkness. A dense fog slithered through the towering trees of Blackwood Forest, coiling around. The abandoned mansion like a predator watching its prey. The house had stood there for decades, untouched yet rotting. Its walls cracked like ancient scars. The air reeked of mildew, decay, and something else, something foul, something dead. But the worst part wasn't the silence. It was the whispers, faint at first, then growing. They're coming. They shouldn't have come. Inside the house, the walls breathed. Shadows shifted where there was no light. The air vibrated with something unseen, something old, something hungry. And then, a scream shattered the night. Not human, not animal, something in between. A flickering lantern outside the house died, swallowed by an invisible force. The door, which had been locked for years, creaked open with an agonizing wail. A gust of freezing air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and blood. The house wasn't abandoned. It had never been. And tonight it was waiting. For them. The night was restless. The kind that gnawed at the edges of sanity, whispering things that weren't supposed to be heard. The streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows that stretched unnaturally along the pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howled, a long, sorrowful wail that sent a shiver down the spine of anyone still awake to hear it. Daniel tightened his grip on the mysterious black envelope in his hands. He had received it 3 days ago. No sender, no explanation, just an address, deep within Blackwood Forest, and a chilling message at the bottom. Come if you dare, the past is waiting. The same letter had found its way to 3 others. Alina, an investigative journalist known for exposing the darkest secrets buried by time. She had received hers on the same day, slipped beneath her locked apartment door. Samir, a former cop disgraced and dismissed after a case went horribly wrong. His letter had arrived in an evidence box he hadn't touched in years. Sarah, an artist tormented by nightmares of a house she had never seen until now. Her letter had been taped to her bedroom mirror inside her locked apartment. None of them had spoken before. None of them knew why they had been chosen. Yet here they were, standing before the house that should not exist. The house of the lost. The mansion loomed before them, its windows like hollow eyes staring into the void. The trees around it were twisted, their branches curling like skeletal fingers, reaching for something unseen. A foul stench clung to the air, earth rot and something metallic. Blood? Samir broke the silence, his voice tight. This place, it's wrong. Alina exhaled sharply, pulling her coat closer. Then why do I feel like it's been waiting for us? Daniel stepped forward, his pulse hammering against his ribs. He reached for the rusted iron gate, fingers barely grazing it when... Slam! The gate swung open on its own. The air around them dropped in temperature. The fog thickened, wrapping around them like a living thing. Sarah let out a sharp breath. We shouldn't go in. But the house had already decided. The front door creaked open, revealing a darkness so deep it seemed to breathe. The inside was cold, unnaturally so. The walls pulsed as though the house itself was alive. A distant whisper crawled through the air. You came, you shouldn't have. Alina swallowed hard. Did you hear that? Before anyone could answer, the door slammed shut behind them. And then the lights went out. Total, consuming darkness. A soft giggling echoed from the top of the stairs, and the whispers turned into screams. The darkness inside the house was unnatural, thick, suffocating, almost alive. It swallowed every breath, every heartbeat. The air was cold, not the kind of cold that came with the night, but something deeper, something that gnawed at the skin and sent shivers down to the bone. For a long moment, none of them moved. Then, a faint giggle echoed from the staircase, followed by the slow, rhythmic creaking of wood, as if something or someone was rocking back and forth in the darkness above. Sarah's fingers dug into Danielle's arm. Her breath was ragged. There's someone here. Danielle's mind was screaming at him to run, but his body refused to move. His investigator instincts had encountered darkness before, but this was something else. Samir reached into his jacket, pulling out a small flashlight. He flicked it on. The dim beam cut through the dark, revealing a long, dust-covered hallway, lined with portraits. The faces in the paintings were wrong, their eyes too. Hollow, their expressions frozen in something between a scream and a smile. Alina exhaled sharply. Those paintings, they look like they're watching us. Samir aimed the flashlight upward. The rocking sound stopped instantly. Silence. The stairs ahead were coated in dust as if no one had stepped foot here in decades. But then why did it feel like something had just been there? Watching, listening, waiting. Sarah shuddered. We need to leave, now. Danielle shook his head. The door locked behind us. We're not getting out until we find another way. Samir exhaled, rubbing his temples. Fine, but we stick together. Just then, the flashlight flickered, and the whispering began again. You shouldn't be here. They see you now. Run, before he wakes up. A loud thud crashed from upstairs, shaking the floor beneath them. Then footsteps, heavy, slow footsteps, coming down the stairs. The flashlight died, and the whispers turned into laughter. The darkness pressed against them, thick as tar. Samir's flashlight had died, leaving them stranded in the pitch-black hallway. The only sounds were their uneven breaths and the slow, deliberate footsteps descending from the upper floor. Each step was heavy, too heavy, like something large was coming toward them. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, whispering, Please, please let this be a dream. Then just as suddenly as they had begun, the footsteps stopped. Total silence. Then a breath. Right behind them. Helena screamed as Danielle swung his arm wildly into the darkness. His fist met. Nothing but air. Samir fumbled with the flashlight, slapping it against his palm. It flickered back to life, revealing nothing. The hallway was empty. The stairs were empty. But something had been there, watching, breathing. Samir wiped his face, his pulse hammering. We need to find answers now. Danielle nodded. His grip tightened around the old leather folder in his hand, the case file he had found in the study earlier. The words on the cover sent a chill through his spine. Malik family missing, presumed dead. Sarah glanced at the file, her voice barely a whisper. Who were they? Danielle flipped the file open, revealing aged black and white photos. A family of 4. Father, mother, 2 children, all smiling, all unaware that this would be the last picture ever taken of them. He read aloud, his voice steady despite the growing dread. The Malik family disappeared on the night of November 17, 1988. Last seen at their residence in Blackwood Manor. No bodies were recovered, no signs of forced entry. The case remains unsolved. Samir's jaw clenched. I remember this case. I was just a rookie cop back then. The investigation led nowhere. They searched this house for weeks but never found a single trace of the family. Alina turned the pages. There was an old police report with the housekeeper's statement. She read it under her breath. The children kept talking about a man in the walls. They said he watched them sleep. Sarah's breath hitched. A man in the walls? Before anyone could respond, a bang shattered the silence. The group spun around. One of the paintings in the hallway had fallen to the ground. The frame had cracked, revealing something behind it. Danielle stepped forward, reaching for the broken frame, and froze. Behind the painting was something carved into the wall itself. 4 words. We are still here. A child's handwriting. A rush of ice filled Danielle's veins. They never left. The lights flickered violently, the walls groaned, and then a small handprint appeared on the dusty wooden floor. Then another. Then dozens. Tiny, pale handprints crawling toward them. The whispers rose into a deafening scream. The screams were everywhere, not coming from a single direction but from the walls. The ceiling, the floor beneath them. Sarah clamped her hands over her ears. Make it stop, please, make it stop. Then, just as suddenly as they had begun, the screams cut off. Silence. The only sound was their own ragged breathing. Samir's flashlight flickered, barely holding on. The beam trembled as he swept it, across the hallway until it stopped at the end of the corridor. A door, different from the others. It wasn't covered in dust. No cobwebs, no signs of time wearing it down. It looked new, and yet something about it felt wrong. Alina swallowed hard. That door. It's been waiting for us. Danielle stepped closer. A low humming sound filled the air, vibrating through his bones. He reached out, hesitated, then placed his palm against the door. It was warm. The others watched in tense silence as Danielle gripped the handle and turned it. The door creaked open, and what lay beyond made their stomachs twist in horror. Inside the nursery. It was a nursery, a child's room untouched by time. The walls were painted in faded pastel colors. A small crib sat in the corner, rocking ever so slightly, on its own. Alina's breath hitched. This doesn't make sense. If this house was abandoned for Decades, how is this room still fresh? The floorboards beneath them groaned. Samir shone the flashlight across the room, stopping at a small wooden rocking chair. It was moving slowly back and forth. And then, a soft giggle. Not from behind them. From inside the crib, Sarah grabbed Danielle's arm. No, we need to leave now. But Danielle couldn't move. His eyes were locked on the crib. The others watched in horror as a small hand rose from beneath the covers. A child's voice, delicate yet filled with something ancient, whispered, "He's coming." The crib flipped over violently, slamming against the wall. The entire room shuddered as if the house itself was alive. The rocking chair stopped moving. The whispers ceased. And then, from the doorway behind them, a low growl. Samir spun around, shining the flashlight toward the door. The light flickered violently, revealing a tall, twisted figure standing in the shadows. Its face was wrong, stretched too long. Its mouth curled into something that resembled a grin, but its teeth were too many. Its eyes were nothing but black pits. And it was watching them. The whispers returned. But now they were all saying the same thing. "He is awake!" The door slammed shut, and the lights went out. Total darkness. The door had slammed shut, sealing them inside the nursery with it. The whispering grew louder, twisting into voices that weren't quite human. Some were high-pitched childlike giggles, while others were deep guttural murmurs, like something ancient speaking a language long forgotten. Sarah's breathing was shallow. She couldn't see anything, but she could feel it. Something was in the room with them. Samir fumbled for the flashlight. His hands were shaking. He smacked it hard, once, twice, until finally, the beam flickered back to life. And there it was, standing right in front of them. A grotesque figure, impossibly tall, its limbs too long, its skin pale and stretched like old leather. Its face was a nightmarish mask of emptiness, no nose, no lips, just a wide, unnatural grin. But its eyes, black, endless, and inside them something moved. Daniel froze. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to obey. His heart slammed against his ribs as the thing tilted its head slightly, studying them like a predator sizing up its prey. And then, it moved. Not walked. Glided. A jerky, unnatural motion as if it wasn't supposed to exist in this world. Samir took a step back. His voice was barely a whisper. "That's not human." The creature's neck snapped sideways at an impossible angle. Then, a child's voice came from its twisted mouth. "Do you want to play?" Sarah let out a choked sob. "No, no, no, no!" The thing lurched forward. The flashlight flickered again, the beam cutting in and out, each time revealing the creature closer. It was playing with them. One flicker. It stood by the crib. Second flicker. It was in the middle of the room. Third flicker. Right in front of Danielle. Its grin stretched wider. And then, the light went out completely. Darkness swallowed them whole, and something breathed against Danielle's ear. "Run." A force slammed into them. The air shattered with the sound of breaking furniture. Someone screamed. The door burst open on its own. They ran, tearing through the dark hallways, past the whispering walls, past the paintings whose eyes followed them. But the house was shifting. Corridors stretched. Doors that had been there before vanished. They were trapped. And behind them, the thing was coming. The house was alive. Daniel ran, his breath ragged, his mind screaming for a way out. But the hallways stretched impossibly long, twisting into directions that shouldn't exist. The walls seemed to move, pulse, closing in around them. Alina was just behind him, her trembling fingers gripping Sarah's wrist as they stumbled forward. "Samir, where's Samir?" Daniel's stomach clenched. He turned his head just in time to see the thing was still coming. It moved unnaturally, its elongated limbs bending in ways that defied logic. Its black eyes burned, two endless voids. It didn't run, it simply glided forward, its twisted body flickering in and out of existence as if it didn't belong in this world. Samir's voice rang from behind them. "Go, don't stop!" Sarah's breath hitched. "Where are we supposed to go? The house is—" Her words cut off as she stumbled. The floor beneath her had changed. No longer wooden, no longer solid. It was soft, wet, like rotting flesh. A low, grotesque squelch echoed as she scrambled to her feet. She looked down and screamed. The floor was breathing. Pale, decayed hands were pushing through the surface, their fingers twitching, their nails broken and bloody, dozens of them, reaching, crawling, hungry. Alina grabbed her. "Don't look down, keep moving." Danielle yanked open the nearest door and shoved them inside. They crashed into another room, slamming the door behind them. The whispers outside faded, but the horror was far from over. The room was wrong. No furniture, no windows, just mirrors. Every inch of the walls was covered in tall, ancient mirrors, their glass cracked and fogged, yet still reflecting something. Something that wasn't right. Danielle's reflection didn't move like him. Samir, panting, pressed a hand against one of the mirrors. His reflection grinned back at him, but he wasn't smiling. Sarah whimpered. I don't like this. Alina stepped forward hesitantly, her eyes scanning the mirrors. What is this place? The answer came from inside the glass. A soft tap, then another. Then, a handprint appeared on the other side of the mirror. Small, childlike. Sarah stepped back, shaking her head. No, 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 no. The mirrors began to ripple. And then, they stepped out. Figures crawled through the glass, their bodies twisted. Their faces distorted copies of Danielle, Alina, Sarah, and Samir. But their eyes were empty and their mouths, grinning, too wide, too sharp. The reflections were alive. And they were coming for them. The mirror doppelgangers crawled out of the glass, their distorted limbs twitching, unnaturally. Their grins stretched too wide, their teeth jagged like broken glass. Their eyes, hollow, endless voids, locked onto the group like hunters cornering their prey. Sarah stumbled back, her hands shaking. This isn't real. This can't be real. The mirrored version of Sarah tilted its head in a jerky, unnatural movement. Then, in a voice that sounded almost human, almost hers, it whispered, "But it is, Sarah. We are real, and we are so very hungry." Danielle's blood turned to ice. Samir yanked out his pocket knife and slashed at the reflected version of himself, but the blade passed through air as if the thing wasn't really there. Then in a heartbeat the reflection moved. Not forward, but beside him. Samir barely had time to react before a cold hand clamped around his throat. The mirrored Samir grinned, tightening its grip. Its fingers burned ice cold as if death itself was wrapped around him. "Fighting won't help," it whispered. "You belong here now." Danielle lunged, grabbing Samir's arm and yanking him free. Samir gasped, stumbling back, his skin burning from the touch. The mirror creatures advanced, their distorted faces twitching, their jagged teeth snapping in eerie delight. Sarah screamed as her mirror self reached for her, its fingers stretching longer than humanly possible. "We have to get out of here," Alina shouted. But the door was gone. Or rather, it had never been there. The room was shifting, melting, twisting. The mirrors were no longer just reflecting reality, they were creating it. And then, the floor cracked open. A deep, bottomless abyss yawned beneath them, swallowing the room in pure darkness. And from that darkness a voice rose, a voice that didn't belong to the mirror creatures. It belonged to something else, something that had been waiting. "You cannot leave, you are part of the house now." The mirrors shattered all at once. The glass shards hung in midair, then flew toward them like daggers. Danielle grabbed Sarah and Alina, pulling them to the floor. Samir barely dodged a shard that sliced straight through his sleeve, missing his skin by an inch. And then, the abyss swallowed them whole. Epilogue. The silence was deafening. The house stood empty once more. No whispers, no movement, just the creaking of old wood, the faint wind howling through shattered windows. The room where Danielle, Samir, Sarah, and Alina had fallen was gone, replaced by nothing but a cold, endless void. The mirrors lay shattered, their fragments scattered across the floor, but within those broken pieces, reflections still moved. Trapped, faint images of four terrified souls flickered across the cracked surfaces, their mouths open in silent screams, their hands pressed against the glass, banging, clawing, trying to escape. But no one would ever hear them. Outside, the wind blew through the overgrown trees surrounding Blackwood Manor. The missing persons reports would be filed in the coming days. Investigators would search the house, but just like the Mullick family before them, no trace of Danielle, Samir, Sarah, or Alina would ever be found. The town would whisper about the house. The legend would grow, and the house would wait, because it always did, because it was hungry, and sooner or later someone else would enter, and it would never let them leave. Second and final part. Trapped in the glass. The Blackwood Manor stood in eerie silence, untouched yet tainted by the whispers of the past. The towering walls, built from ancient stone, seemed to pulse, with something unseen, something alive. The house had stood for centuries, and for centuries it had been hungry. Danielle, Samir, Sarah, and Alina were just the latest victims. The police searched every room, every hallway, but there was nothing. No bodies, no belongings. Their cell phones had last pinged from inside the house, but inside, it was as if they had never existed. No fingerprints, no footprints, no sign of struggle, just mirrors. Old, cracked mirrors that lined the walls of the manor. And inside those mirrors, the faint shifting shadows of faces that no longer belonged to this world. The case was closed. 4 people lost without a trace. The town moved on. But then weeks later, someone noticed something terrifying. In a photograph taken by the police during their investigation, a mirror in the background showed 4 figures standing there. Figures that weren't there in reality. Figures with wide, terrified eyes. Figures screaming in silence. The photograph was destroyed. The police refused to speak of it. And Blackwood Manor? It waited. Because it knew someone else would come looking. And when they did, it would be ready. The wind howled through the dead trees, rattling the rusted iron gate of Blackwood Manor like a warning. The moonlight barely touched the house, as if even the night was afraid to acknowledge it. Amr stood at the entrance, his fists clenched. He had to do this. Behind him, Zoya, Timur, and Fahad hesitated. "We shouldn't be here," Zoya whispered. "We don't have a choice," Amr replied. "Daniel and the others never left this house. If we don't find out what happened to them, no one ever will." Timur let out a shaky breath. "And what if we never leave either?" A heavy silence settled between them. That was the real fear. But Amr refused to walk away. He took a step forward. The old wooden door creaked open on its own. A blast of cold air rushed out, carrying the scent of rotting wood. And something else, something sour. Metallic. Like blood. "It's welcoming us," Fahad muttered. "Or inviting them in." Zoya pulled out her flashlight. "Let's make this quick." One by one, they stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind them. The air inside was thick, almost suffocating. Dust floated in the dim light of their flashlights. The wallpaper was peeling, the chandeliers hung like skeletal remains, and the floor creaked beneath their every step. But what unsettled them most? The paintings on the walls. Dozens of them, old and faded, showing people in Victorian-era clothing. Their faces were blurred, but their eyes, those were too sharp, too real. Almost like they were watching. Timur shuddered. "This place is worse than I imagined." Amr ignored him and pressed forward. They entered what used to be a living room. The fireplace was filled with ashes long gone cold. The mirrors on the wall were cracked. But somehow they still reflected their images perfectly. "Check this out," Zoya said, running her fingers over a dust-covered table. "The dust here is untouched." "Meaning?" Fahad asked. "Meaning no one's been inside for years." Amr's jaw tightened. "Then where did Daniel and the others go?" No one had an answer. Then, a soft whisper, so faint that they almost missed it. "Leave." Fahad sucked in a sharp breath. Did you hear that?" Amr turned, scanning the room. "Who's there?" The silence that followed was too thick. Then, the floorboards groaned behind them. They spun around. Nothing. But something felt different. The air was heavier, as if the house had exhaled. Timur took a step back, but his foot brushed against something. He looked down and froze. A shoe, half buried under an old tattered rug. Zoya crouched down, pulling it out. The second she dusted it off, her breath hitched. It was Sarah's shoe. A shiver ran through them. This was proof. They had been here. But where were they now? The wind outside picked up, making the old windows rattle. The chandelier swayed slightly, despite there being no breeze inside. "We should leave," Timur muttered. Amr shook his head. "No, we're close. Something happened here, and I want to know what." As if responding to his words, something shifted. The mirror across the room rippled. Like water. Fahad grabbed Amr's arm. "Tell me you saw that." Amr didn't respond. He was already moving toward it. Zoya grabbed his wrist. "Are you insane?" But Amr barely heard her. There was movement inside the mirror. And then, a handprint appeared on the glass. A pale, ghostly handprint. The fingers were too long. The skin too stretched, and then, it moved. The hand on the glass curled into a fist. And then, it knocked. 3 times. Knock, knock, knock. Amr staggered back, his breath coming out in gasps. And then the whisper returned. But this time, it was louder. "You shouldn't have come back." The knock echoed through the silent room like a pulse of something alive. Amar's heart pounded in his chest as the group stared at the mirror where the handprint had just formed. The glass shimmered as though something was breathing beneath the surface. Then slowly, the handprint faded. But the cold, lingering presence remained. Fahad took a step back. "I don't like this. We need to get out now." Zoya nodded, gripping her flashlight tighter. "That wasn't normal. This house, it's not just abandoned. It's waiting for something." "Waiting for us," Timur whispered, eyes darting around the room. Amr exhaled sharply. No, they had come too far. They needed answers. He turned back to the mirror. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice firm but cautious. Silence. Then, the chandelier above them swung violently. The old metal creaked, dust rained down, and a loud, piercing shriek filled the air. The mirror rippled again. And then in a flash, something emerged. A face pressed against the glass. Not human, not fully. The skin was stretched too thin, the eyes sunken yet wide, filled with infinite darkness. The mouth was frozen open, as if caught in an eternal scream. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. The mirror returned to normal. But the room didn't. The air had changed. The house felt closer, like something had just woken up. Fahad stumbled back, knocking over an old vase. "That's it. We're leaving." Zoya grabbed Amar's arm. "We can't stay here, Amr. This place isn't abandoned. It's alive." But Amr was staring at the mirror, his breathing heavy. The reflection had changed. The four of them were still visible, but behind them, there were more. 4 shadowy figures standing right behind them. A soft, wet whisper brushed against their ears. "Help us." It was familiar. "Sarah." Amr whipped around. No one was there. He turned back to the mirror, his blood running cold. The shadows were still there, but now their faces were visible. Daniel, Samir, Sarah, Alina. Their expressions were twisted with terror. Their mouths moved, but no sound escaped. Sarah's reflection pressed a hand against the glass. Amr stepped forward, breathless. "Sarah?" Her lips parted, and this time the whisper was louder. "Break it before it's too late." The room shook violently. The lights flickered. The air grew heavy with an unbearable pressure, as if the walls themselves were pushing in on them. The mirror cracked. A long, jagged line split Sarah's face in half. Then, the door behind them slammed shut. Locked. Timur rattled the handle. "It won't open." Fahad pounded on it. "We're trapped." A low, inhuman growl echoed from somewhere deep inside the house. And then, a new voice emerged from the shadows. Deep, hollow, hungry. "No one leaves." The candles lining the walls burst into flame. Their light flickered wildly, casting monstrous shadows across the room. The flames were blue, unnatural, cold. Zoya grabbed Amr's wrist. "Whatever's happening, we need to do what Sarah said. Break the mirror." Amr didn't hesitate. He grabbed the nearest chair and swung it hard. The mirror shattered, and all hell broke loose. The moment the glass shattered, the house screamed. Not a normal sound, not wood breaking or glass falling, a real agonized otherworldly scream. The sound shook the walls, making the portraits tremble and the floorboards crack. The shadows in the mirror spilled out like smoke, twisting and writhing. For a second, just 1 second, Sarah, Daniel, Samir, and Alina were visible in the air. Their eyes met Amr's, and then they vanished. The blue flame snapped out. The room fell into complete silence. Then a creak. The door, which had been locked, swung open. A sharp gust of wind blew through the house, carrying a single whisper. "Run!" And so they ran. The 4 of them didn't stop running until they were out of Blackwood Manor, breathless and trembling. The house loomed behind them, silent once more. But as Amr turned back one last time, he saw something. The mirrors inside the house. They had reformed, perfect, untouched, as if nothing had ever happened. And in the largest one, staring right at him, was his own reflection, except it wasn't moving. And then it smiled. Amr's breath caught in his throat. His reflection inside the house, it was smiling. But he wasn't. His body felt frozen, his mind screaming at him to look away, to run, to not acknowledge it, but he couldn't move, he could only stare. Then, the reflection's head tilted unnaturally to the side. "You didn't save them." The voice wasn't coming from the mirror. It was inside his head. Zoya grabbed Amr's arm. "Amr, let's go!" Her voice snapped him back. He tore his gaze away from the mirror and turned to run. The four of them rushed down the broken path, leaving Blackwood Manor behind. But something wasn't right. As they reached their car, Timur fumbled for the keys, his hands shaking. "We need to get out of here now." He unlocked the doors and they all scrambled inside. The engine roared to life. Amr sat in the passenger seat, his breathing ragged, his mind reeling from what he had seen. Then, Fahad's voice broke the silence. "Why? Is there someone sitting in the back seat?" The blood in Amr's veins turned to ice. Slowly, too afraid to turn, he glanced at the rearview mirror, and his heart stopped. Between Zoya and Fahad in the back seat, there was a fifth person. A man. His face was completely obscured in darkness, as if the shadows refused to reveal his features. But his hands, his long bony hands, were resting calmly on his lap, and he was staring at Amr. Amr couldn't breathe. Zoya, sensing something was wrong, turned to look. But there was no one there, only in the mirror, only in the reflection. Amr's voice came out in a broken whisper. "Drive." Timur didn't question him. He slammed his foot on the accelerator. The car sped down the road, leaving Blackwood Manor behind. But Amr made one mistake. He looked into the rearview mirror one last time, and the shadowed figure lifted its hand and waved. They didn't stop until they reached Zoya's apartment, where they all sat in stunned silence. Fahad wiped the sweat from his face. What the hell just happened? What was that house? No one had an answer. Amr was still struggling to breathe. What had he seen? Who was in the mirror? He stood up. "I need some air." As he walked toward the small apartment balcony, he passed by the hallway mirror. He froze. His reflection, it had stopped. Amr had taken a step forward, but his reflection hadn't. It was just standing there, staring at him. Then it grinned. A slow, wide, unnatural grin. Amr stumbled back. And then, the reflection raised its hand. Amr looked down at his own hand. He wasn't moving, but his reflection was. The grin widened. Then, in a whisper that sounded like 1,000 voices speaking at once, "The house never lets go." Then, the mirror shattered. The mirror shattered, and a sudden gust of cold air blasted through the apartment. Amr stumbled backward, his breath caught in his throat. The others rushed in, alarmed by the sound. "What the hell just happened?" Timur demanded. Amr's hands trembled as he pointed at the broken mirror. "My reflection. It moved on its own." Zoya swallowed hard. "You mean like in the manor?" Amr nodded. "Worse, it smiled at me, it spoke." A thick silence settled in the room. A thick silence settled in the room. Fahad looked around, his face pale. "Guys, does anyone else feel like we're not alone?" Zoya turned off the lights. The four of them held their breath as they waited in the darkness. For a moment, everything was still. Then, from the shattered mirror, a whisper. "We see you." A cold chill ran down their spines. And then, the pieces of the broken mirror began to move. The glass shards on the floor shuddered, then slowly dragged themselves across the wooden surface, forming words. Zoya's voice came out in a terrified whisper. "It's spelling something." They all watched in horror as the message took shape. "You let them in." Amr's heart pounded. No, this isn't possible." Fahad's breath was shaky. "What does it mean? Who did we let in?" As if answering, the room's temperature dropped. A faint sound echoed from the walls. A soft, rhythmic tapping. "Knock, knock, knock." The same knock from Blackwood Manor. Zoya's voice trembled. "It followed us." Then the television flickered on. The screen was filled with static, and in the middle of the static, a distorted face appeared. Sarah. Her mouth was moving, but the sound was garbled. Then slowly, her voice broke through. "You shouldn't have left. It's coming." The screen glitched violently, her face contorting into something inhuman before the TV shut off. A new whisper filled the air. "It's already here." The knocking sound grew louder, closer. Then, the closet door creaked open. No one moved, no one breathed. The door to the closet was half open, revealing nothing but a dark void. And yet, something was inside. Amr's pulse was racing. His body screamed at him to run, but something stronger held him in place. A shadow slid out of the darkness. At first it was formless, but as it moved, it took shape. Tall, thin, wrong. A man-like figure, but its arms were too long, its fingers sharp and bony. Its face was missing. Just a void of shifting darkness. Timur took a shaky step back. Oh God. The thing lifted its head and spoke. The house is hungry. Amr couldn't move. The figure raised its hand and pointed directly at him. Then, it lunged. Oh, the lights exploded. A blast of icy wind swept through the room as the entity rushed forward. Amr barely managed to dodge, falling backward onto the ground. The others screamed, scrambling to escape. But as Zoya and Fahad ran toward the door, it slammed shut. "Let us out!" Fahad banged against the door, his voice cracking with terror. The shadow figure moved toward Amr, its faceless void inches away. Then, it spoke again. "You brought us here, you belong to us now." Amr's vision blurred, his mind spun. He could hear something else, faint whispers overlapping. Danielle, Sarah, Samir, Alina. "Don't listen, don't let it take you." Amr squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block them out. Then, Zoya grabbed his arm. "We have to break its link, the mirror's there, its anchor." Amr's eyes snapped open. The mirror, even though the first one had shattered, a second one still stood in the hallway. And inside it, their reflections were missing. Only the shadow stood there staring at them. Amr didn't hesitate. He grabbed the nearest heavy object, a metal lamp, and threw it with all his strength. The mirror exploded into shards. The shadow figure let out an inhuman shriek, twisting violently. The air shook, the room groaned, and then everything went still. The temperature returned to normal. The door unlocked. The house was silent. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Fahad slowly pushed open the door. They were free, or so they thought. The four of them rushed outside, gasping for air as they stumbled onto the street. The night was quiet. Too quiet. Amr turned back toward the apartment, and in the window, there was a reflection. Not his own, not Zoya's, not Timur's or Fahad's, but Sarah's. Her face was twisted in horror, her lips forming a single word. "Run." Then, a shadow moved behind her, and the lights inside flickered out. The street was empty. The night was too silent, too still. Amr stood frozen, his gaze locked on the apartment window. Sarah's reflection had vanished, but the shadow hadn't. It was still there, still watching, still waiting. Fahad grabbed Amr's arm. "We need to go, now." Amr's throat was dry. "Go where?" Zoya's voice was sharp with fear. "As far away from here as possible." Timur fumbled with his phone. I'll book a hotel. We just need to get out of this area." A cold gust of wind cut through them. Then, the streetlights flickered and went out. A low hum filled the air. Not mechanical, not electrical. Something else. Something alive. Amr's skin crawled. Fahad swallowed hard. "It's still here, isn't it?" A voice whispered directly behind them. "You never left." They spun around. No one was there. But the shadows stretched unnaturally under the dim glow of the moon, twisting, shifting, reaching for them. Zoya grabbed Amr's hand. "We're leaving, now." They didn't argue. They ran. Oh, the car's tires screeched as they sped down the road, the city lights flickering past. Zoya kept glancing at the rearview mirror. "It's following us, I know it is." Timur's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "I don't see anything." "That's the problem," Amr whispered. "It's never in front of us, only behind." Fahad let out a shuddering breath. "We just need to make it to the hotel." Minutes passed in tense silence. Then, Timur's face went pale. Amr noticed first. "What?" Timur's hands tightened on the wheel. I don't know where we are." Fahad frowned. "What are you talking about? We've been driving straight." Zoya checked her phone's GPS. Her hands began to tremble. Her voice cracked. "We're back." Amr's heart dropped. He looked out the window. His blood ran cold. They were right back where they started. Blackwood Manor stood before them, waiting. House calls them home. "No!" Zoya shouted. "We didn't turn around. This isn't possible." Timur's hands shook. I don't remember driving here." Fahad threw open the door. "I'm done. I'm not going back in there." But the second he stepped onto the road, the wind died. The air went heavy, suffocating. Then, the whispers returned. "It's time." Amr's stomach twisted. "Get back in the car, Fahad, now." But Fahad wasn't listening. He was staring at something just ahead. His voice was barely a whisper. "Sarah?" Amr followed his gaze, and his heart nearly stopped. Sarah stood at the front of Blackwood Manor. But something was wrong. Her feet weren't touching the ground. Her body was stiff, unnatural. Her mouth opened, too wide, and then in a voice that wasn't hers, "Come home." The front door of the manor swung open. Darkness spilled out, and the shadows moved, houses alive. The ground shook beneath them. Amr didn't think. He grabbed Fahad's arm, yanking him back toward the car. "Drive," he shouted at Timur. Timur slammed the gas pedal. The tires screeched as the car sped forward, directly toward the house. "No, the other way," Zoya screamed. "I am!" Timur's voice cracked with panic. "It's pulling us in!" The steering wheel twisted violently in his hands. The car veered out of control. And then, everything went black. When Amr opened his eyes, he was somewhere else. The manor. No, inside the manor. The air was thick with dust, decay, and something else. Something watching. His breath came in ragged gasps. No, we weren't supposed to come back." A whisper brushed against his ear. "You never left." Amr spun around. The others were gone. He was alone. And then, a cold, bony hand touched his shoulder. He screamed. The others. Somewhere else in the house. Zoya was running blindly. The halls stretched endlessly, impossibly long. Every door she passed slammed shut. A voice called her name. A voice she hadn't heard in years. "Zoya, it's me." She stopped. Her breath hitched. Slowly, she turned and saw her sister, the sister who had died 3 years ago, standing at the end of the hallway, her eyes black as night. Timur was in the basement. The room was small, suffocating. He didn't remember how he got there. All he knew was the walls were whispering, and the whispers knew his name. He turned and found himself staring at his own reflection. But his reflection was smiling. Then, it stepped forward. Out of the mirror. Fahad was outside, or at least he thought he was. The garden stretched endlessly. The trees shifted when he wasn't looking, and in the distance, the house watched. Waiting, Fahad turned and saw himself, hanging from a tree, a noose around his neck, and his own dead eyes staring back. Then, the corpse smiled, and whispered, "It was always going to end this way. The house has them now." Amr stumbled through the manor, heart pounding. "Where are you guys? Where are you?" The house did not answer. Only the shadows. Only the whispers. And then, the doors all slammed shut. The whispers turned into laughter. Dark, hollow, endless. And from deep inside the house, a new voice spoke. "Welcome home."